It's a shame." David agreed to stay. In a few days, John took his first wife and the boys to Bern in Bear Lake County, and I had to stay with his second wife, Magdalena Linder, in that wilderness and feed about 50 cows and 20 calves and about 20 wild horses without a team, and most of the time we were without wood, and I had to go to the river and cut willows and pack them home on my back. His second wife was a very good lady. She had only one girl alive. After this long winter, I was very glad when spring came. Then we had to move, and that's William J., and I drove the cattle. David tells that when they came to Montpelier, Will asked me if I would let him have the 50 cents I had left since coming from Switzerland, and I let him have it, and then he went into the saloon and bought cigars. So I was broke, and so was he. Will was Brother Kunz's oldest son, just a year older than I. David continues, "My sister Rose, Susanna, only stayed with John Kunz about 10 days. Then Jacob Kunz, his brother, came and took her to Bern. Then they went to the Logan Temple, and I had not seen her until I got to Bern in the spring of 1883. Because Jacob Kunz and Susanna Hershey married within weeks, November 14th, 1882, David thought they went to the Logan Temple, which could not have been, as the Logan Temple was not dedicated until May 17th, 1884, and there was no marriage performed there until after the dedication. Jacob and Susanna did not take out their endowments until the 3rd of April, 1884, in the endowment house in Salt Lake City, both on the same day in the same place, and then they were sealed to each other. They were actually married in Paris, Idaho, Bear Lake County, on the 14th of November, 1882, for time only, about 5 to 6 weeks from the time Susanna had arrived at the John Kunz home in early September. David continues, "I worked for John Kunz until July 1883 and had worked out the $100 he had sent for me. My clothes were all worn out, and I didn't have a cent to my name. I then hired out, July 1883, to Chris Kunz for $19 a month. There I had a chance to buy me a pair of shoes and overalls, shirts and stockings. There I had to milk, help make cheese, and herd cattle. Rose and I felt sorry at not having the rest of the family with us, and so we saw Brother Stookie about the money, and he was glad to send them the money to come, and one day less than a year, September 1883, Mother, Arnold, John, and Anna arrived in Montpelier, but Father would not come." David Hershey continues his story after hiring on with Christian Kunz. Chris Kunz and his brother Robert were running a dairy in Bern. They milked about 200 cows and had from 8 to 9 people to milk them. I milked 25 and sometimes more. Many times we milked until 10 a.m. These cows, after milking, were turned out in the hills, and I was asked to take care of them. Robert says in his history that he, Will, David, and Father, with Jacob as the head cheesemaker, began to operate an extensive American cheese factory in Bern in 1882. In the fall, when the cows were returned, Robert says everybody moved away from Bern, so he moved to Montpelier. In the spring of 1883, he and Caroline moved back to Bern, and he and Christian started their own dairy out north, where the Christian Kunz place now is in Bern. Apparently they hired David Hershey in July to help at the dairy and with the herding of the cows. Of that experience, Robert says, and owing to the crowded condition on the open range, I again sold out there and moved to Thomas Fork, which was later called Raymond.
David Hershey says,
"My sister Rosina, after she married was married to Jacob Kunz, made their home in Bern. They built a 2-roomed log house covered with dirt like the rest. They hired Jacob Kunz, their brother Rosina's husband, because he was one of the best cheesemakers at the time. Rosina and Jacob's first child was a boy which they named Jacob. He only lived a little over 2 months. When the next boy was born, they named him Wilford. Rose's health was failing and getting poorer. David tells that on one occasion he went to see Rose, and she was telling him that one day Jacob dropped asleep in a chair, and she had 3 or 4 drops of water in a cup, and she dropped it on the back of his neck, and he kicked me on the leg, and now it has atrophied away until it is a lot smaller than the other one, and many other things he told me. I felt when reading this story that David told it shaded, implying that Jacob might have been a mean and abusive husband. I never knew Jacob, but I have been married for long enough to know that if a wife has an abusive, mean husband, she would not wake him in a playful manner, as she would know what the results would be. As I read this story, I felt that Jacob and Susanna had a playful, loving relationship, and that when Jacob kicked her, it was coming out of a deep sleep with a start and was not intentional. I also feel Susanna had an undiagnosed condition that was causing her health to fail rapidly. In the fall, we moved to Newford, Pegram, to feed cattle, but Rose got weaker and weaker. In April, Jacob, was going to bring her to Bern on the railroad, and when they came to Montpelier and started for Bern in a sleigh, she then commenced to choke and fight for her breath. They had to take her to the hotel, and on Easter Sunday she died. They took her to Bern dead. Before she died, she told Mother to take the baby in her care, but Kunz's would not let him go, and kept him until he was 5 years old. Then they found out he was not normal. Then they told Mother that she could have him now. They gave her the boy, and an old cow came with it, the care or responsibility. After that, we came to the Snake River Valley, where she turned him over to me, so I kept him until this present time. He is now 51 years of age. This is from David Hershey's journal. David Hershey does not mention Jacob's death. Wilford was born on the 15th of May, 1885 in Bern. When the family moved to Pegram in the fall to feed cattle, Wilford would have only been 5 or 6 months old. Susanna died the 25th of April, 1886, when Wilford was 11 and a half months old. Wilford's father, Jacob Kunz, died the 13th of October in 1890. Wilford would have been 5 and a half years old when he was without a father and a mother, with only a stepmother who had a 6-month-old son by Jacob and a 4-year-old son, John Brookbank, by her first marriage, and a 5-year-old stepson of Jacob's, Wilford, who was mentally handicapped. Edith must have been overwhelmed by being widowed at such a young age with a family of 4 with no means of support. And in reality, she was probably the one that made the decision that Grandma Hershey would now take Wilford, who later was given to David, his uncle, where he was still living at age 51. I feel that in David Hershey's journal, some of his negative feelings toward Jacob Kunz, for whatever the reason, impact the slant he puts on the historical stories. Susanna and Jacob were married on the 14th, 1882 in Paris, Idaho. In the spring of 1884, Jacob and Susanna went to the endowment house in Salt Lake City and on the 3rd of April, 1884, they were endowed and their marriage was solemnized. They had their first son, Jacob, on the 29th of July, 1883. They lost their first son, Jacob, on October 7th, 1883. As far as I can find out, he was buried in Ovid, Bear Lake County, Idaho. I can find no record of the boy being sealed to his parents when they were sealed together, and apparently no one else could either. So on the 23rd of January 1969, someone sealed Jacob, the son, to his parents, Jacob and Susanna, in the Logan Temple. After Susanna's death on the 25th of April, 1886, she was buried in the Ovid Cemetery, and Jacob continued to make cheese in Bear Lake County, and he himself, with the aid of his mother and sister-in-laws, looked after and took care of Wilford. Just when Jacob and the Kunz family become aware of Wilford's disability is not known, but sometime between May of 1886 and the 27th of June, 1889, Jacob met and married his second wife, Edith Porter. She had been married before. Jacob and Edith were married the 27th of June, 1889, in Logan, Utah. The record shows that marriage was in the temple. They were only married from June 1889 to October of 1890, about a year and a half, when Jacob died. About a year after that marriage, Edith and Jacob had a son, Irvin Elmer Kunz, on the 20th of April, 1890, in Bern, Bear Lake County. Apparently, Jacob was still working at the Kunz Dairy in the summers and doing other work during the winter months. In October of 1890, Edith was widowed by Jacob's death from typhoid fever, with a 6-month-old baby and a 4-year-old son from a previous marriage, and a 5.5-year-old stepson that was mentally handicapped. Edith is probably the one that made the decision that Wilford could now go live with his grandmother Hershey. Sometime after Jacob's death, Edith left Bear Lake. Edith moved her young family to Arizona, where much of her family had moved to. About 1895, Edith and her 5-year-old son, Irvin Elmer, and her 10-year-old son, John, made the trip to Heber, Arizona by team and wagon. They lived with one of Edith's brothers, Joseph Isaiah Porter, and his wife, in Heber for about a year. Edith then moved her family to the Gila Valley to live with her sister, Nancy Clough, in central Arizona. While Edith was in Central, she took a job of housekeeper for Ben F. Whitmer, a widower with 6 children. She worked for Ben until he remarried an English convert, Sarah Hannah Wibberly, in the Salt Lake Temple in 1901. Because of her total dependence upon her family, Edith finally left her sons with family or friends and went to the Phoenix area and got a nursing degree. Sarah and Ben added 4 more children to their family, though one died in infancy. Sarah's health failed and she died in 1914 and was buried in central Arizona. Edith again helped Ben with his family. Edith and Ben were married in 1915 in the Mesa, Arizona temple. Ben F. Whitmer was Edith's 3rd husband. Edith had been single for about 15 years, and a good part of that 15 years she had been helping Ben Whitmer raise his family. Edith was 41 and Ben was 47 at the time of their marriage. Apparently, Edith had a number of relatives in central Arizona. The 1900 census for Graham County, Arizona shows Edith Kunz, age 36, and John Newton Brookbank, age 15,
and Irvin Elmer Kunz, age 10, living with James and Margaret Clough, and their 3 children, ages 3, 5, and 7, in central Arizona. Margaret Clough was Edith's first cousin. James Clough was the bishop of the Central Ward at age 35. I have no additional information on Johnny Brookbank or his whereabouts until he married Myrtle Campbell in 1909 in Sunset, Arizona. Myrtle died in Wilcox, Cochise County, Arizona in June of 1968. Johnny died at age 44 when he caught himself on fire while cleaning some clothes on September 19, 1929, and was buried in the Safford City Cemetery in Graham County, Arizona. Edith left Elmer at about age 10 with Oscar Francis Webster in central Arizona during this time. Oscar owned the largest individual-owned goat farm in the world at that time, with about 18,000 Angora goats. It was a hard life, but Elmer loved Oscar as he was the only father figure Elmer had ever known. When Elmer was 43 years old, Oscar was killed in an accident, and Milton Kunz, Elmer's son, said it was the only time he saw his father cry. At age 12, Elmer met Bernice Webster, who was 10. She was a niece of Oscar Webster, who had come for a visit. Elmer set his sights to marry her, which he finally did on September 27th of 1911 in Solomonville, Arizona. Elmer and Bernice moved to Globe, Arizona, and started their family there. Edith Bernice was born a year later in Globe and died only 5 months later. 2 years later, Opal came. 2 years after that, Milton joined the family. Then 2 years later, Wanda, and then Charles came 6 years after Wanda. Elmer worked for Standard Oil Company and had his own dairy at Dukin, Arizona, where he involved trouble boys from the Fort Grant Boys Ranch as a correctional officer. He did marvelous things for many troubled boys. Elmer and Bernice were both members of the LDS Church and always considered themselves as part of the saints, but they were never active members. Of Elmer and Bernice's children, only Milton and Opal stayed with the Mormon Church. Charles and Wanda became involved in other churches. Wanda was an outstanding homemaker. Opal taught school besides keeping a home. Charles pursued a military career, and Milton worked at various jobs in California and Arizona to provide for his family. All of Elmer's grandchildren are in Arizona, where most of she and Jacob's descendants still reside today. Jacob was buried in the Obed, Idaho cemetery, along with his first wife Susanna and infant son Jacob. There is now a marker in the Obed cemetery marking the graves of